this is a universal experience where accept that things will never be perfect. To what extent we are functional or dysfunctional. Grief touches everyone, but we don't all grieve the same way. Whether it's the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or the loss of a future we imagine, grief can feel confusing, overwhelming, and deeply personal. We explore the complexities of grief and loss. What's the difference between grief and complicated grief? How do we know when someone needs help? And how can we support ourselves or others through the grieving process? If you or someone you know is navigating grief, this conversation is for you. Joining us today is Vivian Lam, who is a psychologist here at People. So, Vivian, for us to get started with the episode today, perhaps we could start with an introduction of yourself and your professional experience, and also perhaps why you think grief and loss is a good episode for us to record today.
Right. So, hi, my name is Vivian. I'm a clinical psychologist. This is my 5th year practicing in a private practice. So, one of the main reasons that I actually chose grief as one of the topic that I wanted to share has a lot to do with some of my experiences when I was a trainee. So, when I was a trainee, I had the chance to actually work with a group of refugees who struggle with trauma and also prolonged grief as well. So, I get to observe how much grief has actually affected them in their daily life. And I got very interested in to learning how to actually help them to regain their basic functioning in their life, and just so that they can actually have like a better confidence, or just so that they can actually live their life like normal as well.
So you brought up some interesting facts there. You mentioned terms such as trauma, prolonged grief, and these are some of the things that we're likely going to discuss today as part of our conversation. Perhaps we could get started with some basic facts. So, what exactly is grief, and what are some facts, characteristics, things that could help the audience back home understand more of grief and loss?
Mhm. So when we talk about grief, so it's actually a natural emotional response to losses. And when we talk about grief, a lot of times people will automatically associate it with like a loss of like a loved one. But in fact, like grief can actually happen to like non-death related as well. So for example, when someone actually lose something that is actually important to them, that also, grief can also occur. So for example, it could be losing like a relationship by breaking up, or like going through like a divorce, or losing their jobs, or losing health, for example, being diagnosed with chronic illness, or even losing like a sentimental item. I think personally, my first experience with grief could also be when I first say goodbye to my milk bottle when I actually got, enrolled into like a kindergarten, right? So at that time, I was so sad to say goodbye to my milk bottle that it was one of my best friends at that time. So I was actually missing my bottle so much. And I got reminded by my bottle almost every single time when I'm drinking water from a sippy cup, or during snack time when I'm supposed to have my milk, right? So those are actually one of my first few experiences with grief as well, even with items.
So I think when you said that, the first thought that came to my mind is my grief with a pacifier instead. So that was my first experience too.
Yeah, so like there was actually some videos that I saw online that parents actually have like these very cute rituals for their children to actually cope with their grief as well, whereby they're tying balloons to their pacifier and then saying goodbye
Yeah,
to
I
like
think
the
I saw that
pacifier.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's actually one way to help children to deal with grief as well.
Hmm. So I think what you have brought up here is that grief isn't only about bereavement, which is passing away of someone you know or of a loved one, but there can be an observable, similar process that a person goes through when they lose something of value to them. So when we think about grief, fairly certain, I think 99.9% sure that whoever that's listening in on this podcast would have experienced grief in one form or another. If we were to apply a very broad definition of what grief is, I think there are more specific ones we should go into later in the episode. Uh, a universal process, And I think you've also brought up about rituals. That is also part of the grieving process, something that we might discuss when it comes to interventions or what can potentially help. But you've brought up some interesting facts there about grief in general. So when we think about grief in the therapy or mental health psychology world, we are also thinking about different conditions. So with feelings of grief, likely a person is crying, feeling really sad. And as psychologists, we oftentimes want to have a comprehensive understanding of the individual. Is this person going through grief? Or perhaps this person might be feeling depressed, or this person might, I don't know, anxious, other conditions. So, what actually differentiates grief with other common conditions such as depression, anxiety, and so on?
Hmm. I think that's a very good question because I can see a lot of similarities of how, like, someone's going through grief and also someone going through depression as well. One of the most common similarities that we can actually see is that the feeling of like upset or like the feeling of loss and guilt, right? So, but what we can actually differentiate, how we can differentiate between grief and depression is that the intensity and like the duration of like, the upset feeling might be actually different. So, for example, for someone that is actually going through depression, so their sadness might be intense, and at the same time, it might actually happen at any time during the day or even happen the entire day as well. So, like for someone who's actually going through grief, for example, it might be a little bit different. So, for them, it might be that the upset feeling comes in waves. Sometimes we might actually be hit with like the emotions of like, feeling a bit sad, especially when we are actually reminded of someone that we have actually recently lost. And that's a little bit different. So, in terms of like, the thought process, it might also be a little bit different. So like for people who go through depression, they might actually have a lot of like negative thoughts or like they might actually ruminate a lot or like, self-blaming thoughts. So but for people who's going through grief, that's a little bit different. So their thoughts are mainly focused again on like the people or like the things that they have actually lost. So then like the intensity and also like the content or the reasons as to why someone's actually sad can be actually quite different. So like just now you also brought up something about anxiety. So anxiety is actually a little bit different then. So then I get where you're coming from, whereby grief can also actually lead to people experiencing anxiety, especially when you have actually just lost someone that's actually important and then like you're not quite sure how to actually go on with your life without them. So that's when the anxiety can actually come. So like what differs anxiety from someone who's actually experiencing anxiety when they're going through grief is actually pretty similar with how we differentiate depression and grief as well. It's about like the idea of like why someone is actually feeling anxious as well. So for someone who is actually anxious, they might just be like, oh, what is actually going to happen, or what if this actually happened? So, but for someone who's actually going through grief, there will be more focus on still the loss as well.
So, what's important to evaluate here would be the thought content. So, the things that the person might be thinking about that gives rise to a difficult emotion, whether it's overwhelming feelings of sadness, anxiety, or grief. And I think you mentioned um, interesting facts there. So when a person is grieving, they might also be worried about the future, because if I've lost someone, or let's say I've lost a job, right? So then I might be concerned, also anxious about what is to come. When will I get my next job, or will I be able to sustain myself financially, and so on. So that's anxiety and worry related to the job loss. Now, in mental health, we differentiate these conditions: grief, depression, anxiety. But this categorical system oftentimes assists us clinicians to better organize a treatment plan, and for research to be ongoing to determine what needs to be done with certain conditions. But I suppose there are going to be overlaps here. In the DSM-4 or DSM-5, there was a distinction made between bereavement and loss and depression, but not so much of putting grief into its own diagnostic criteria. Because I think in the human experience, we look at it as a full package, but in mental health and as clinicians, when we want to think about helping others, we are trying to sort of differentiate condition A, B, C, and so on. But I think based on your description here, yes, there's clear characteristics that differentiates grief from other conditions, but these things can also overlap in terms of the human experience.
Yeah, that's true. So, but at the same time, what we need to understand about grief, just the experience of grief, and whether or not it is actually something that's problematic, we also need to take a look at like how grief affect us and how much grief actually affect us as well. So then, especially when people actually going through grief, it's actually pretty common for them to actually experience symptoms like having difficulties sleeping, having difficulties concentrating, or like the sadness as well. So these are actually pretty common. But how do we differentiate between like just normal grief or like something that is already affecting us? We can actually take a look at how much it is actually affecting us. So like is the are we still able to actually function with while we're actually dealing with grief, or has that actually affect us? Well, for example, like has our concentration been affected to an extent that we can't show up for work, or like we can no longer function in daily life? So like that's actually one of the things that we can actually take a look at as well, in terms of like differentiating.
And that's an important consideration. To what extent does it actually affect our functioning or our ability to live? If I am grieving, I'm feeling sadness of a loss, but life goes on. I'm pretty much functional. I'm engaged with my relationships. I'm reporting to work. Generally, I'm still maintaining my hobbies and interests. Although on the inside, I'm reminiscing about this person. I miss this person a lot. From a mental health standpoint, actually, that is a pretty normal thing to experience. And as you've mentioned quite early on in the episode, uh, there are a variety of things that we could grieve over. And most definitely, we would encounter at least one event. I would think multiple events in our lives where we would experience grief and loss. So this is a universal experience where it is a process that we have to go through. But there can come a point where this process becomes too overwhelming for the individual, or maybe it goes on for too long, and it gets too complicated to address on an individual basis. That is when I think, as practitioners, we want to have a look at what we can do to assist in this matter.
Right. So adding on to that, like one of the criteria that is actually listed down in DSM for prolonged grief is also to look at the duration of how long someone is actually grieving. So like the thing is with grief, there isn't like a expiry date on how long we should be grieving, but we are actually looking into how long this grieving the effects of like and how much is actually affecting us in terms of like how long it is actually affecting us as well. So for example, like if you can't show up for work like the next day after someone important passes, that's reasonable. But if the symptoms actually persist for 6 months or like almost a year, then this could be like an issue or like a very clear indication that someone is really struggling to move forward from the grief.
Yeah. So um, earlier on, you mentioned about rituals, right? So each time when we encounter a loss, it is something I suppose learned over the course of generations or human civilization that the process of grieving is necessary in order to move on. So if someone we know passes away, we would attend the wake, the funeral, and during these events, there's likely prayers, certain ceremonies. There can be speeches that are done to commemorate the individual. All that is part of recalling experiences and allowing the grieving process to happen so that we could facilitate back into normal everyday living. Uh, Grieving, very normal, but then some individuals, after a prolonged period of time, like what you mentioned, 6 months, 12 months later, they still seem to be caught up in being unable to integrate back into everyday life. So they might be, for example, not eating, not sleeping, the usual things that we do when we are grieving, not attending to relationships, not attending to work. But 1 year later, quite likely there's going to be a variety of physical health, social health, and financial health implications to this. Yeah, yeah. And that is when I think evidence seems to show that professional support perhaps could be indicated as part of getting the person back into everyday living. But I think what you mentioned just now is that grief can be ongoing. It's more of to what extent we are functional or dysfunctional. So I think a clear distinction here is the extent of how much a person isn't able to be functional, and then we might consider treatment for that reason. How do we actually make the judgment as psychologists? When does a person actually need to come in for grief therapy, let's say?
Mm. So like I wouldn't say that there's actually a like clear indication as to when, but some of the signs that we can actually look out for. So for example, if you think that you might actually benefit from talking to someone about grief, because a lot of times like living in Asian household, grief seems to be like a taboo thing that, not a lot of people know how to talk about it. Not a lot of people know how to process or respond to like, you sharing about your grief. So like, perhaps if you want someone to actually listen to you or like help you to process through those emotions, like it would be, helpful to consider maybe talking to like a professional. Or maybe like what we mentioned just now, like, when you start noticing that your functioning is actually being severely affected, and then like you feel that you actually need a little bit extra help to help you to get back on your track, like on how to actually continue on with like your daily routine a little bit more functional. So that would also be like a very good indication as to when you actually need help.
Okay. So there's two potential reasons here. And reason number one could still fall within the range of adaptive grief. And for the most part, I think society has structured itself in a way where people can go through the process of grieving effectively, such as going through a funeral or a wake, or maybe in the case of a loss of a relationship, friends and family to console you, and I don't know, social media and blogs to express yourself. There has been certain mediums or outlets in order to go through the grieving process. But sometimes that avenue might not be available for select individuals. Maybe they were unable to attend a wake or a funeral effectively, uh, despite having someone close to them passing away. Or they might have gone through an abrupt end to their romantic relationship and just don't know how to deal with the loss. So rather than suppressing or being in denial of that event, it is in the benefit of grieving to allow that process to actually happen. So then that person, in your opinion, can consider actually meeting someone to talk to about this.
Or maybe sometimes like when we're actually going through grief, there are also like a lot of things that's actually going through our minds. It could be like memories with this person, or like we could also be like what we mentioned, like the fear towards like the future. So a lot of times, like our mind can also be pretty jumbled up. So if you just want to have like a safe space to also help you to arrange, some of the, or maybe to actually just focus, or like just to have like a clear up your mind, so like to really understand what's actually going on, so that will also be like a good time to actually seek help.
I suppose this still falls within the range of maybe a supportive kind of therapy where the individual can still be considered within the range of being adaptive, right? But perhaps meeting some stuck points that might require some facilitation. But alternatively, I think this is where it falls within a more clinical range of issues where the person 1 year in still pretty much disorganized, unable to get back into usual life. And that is when I think professional support can be clearly indicated. In the literature, this is called complicated grief, or in the DSM, which is a manual that we use for diagnosis of mental disorders, uh, prolonged grief disorder. In this case, then there's going to be more structured therapies that are available, interventions that have shown good evidence that this can help an individual shorten the duration of complicated grief or improve their functioning with regards to this condition. So when it comes to complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, What are the psychological treatments available for them?
So in grief, when it comes to different clinical approaches, so we actually have like a few different types of approaches that we can actually help with grief as well. Today, I'm just going to share two. So the first one is actually CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So like in CBT, the main thing that we do here is actually take a look at our client's thoughts, emotions, and also behavior. So what we mainly do in therapy is to actually help our clients to actually identify if they have any maladaptive thoughts or maladaptive behavior that they might actually have. For example, like thoughts like that's related to guilt. I should have actually done something, to prevent like the death, like or this person could have done more. So like what we understand here is that these thoughts may not be very helpful for them to actually go through like the process of grief and might actually uh exacerbate their intensity of like the grief. So then we will actually help them to actually reframe their thoughts and then just to think about like more neutral thoughts and something that might be actually helpful for them as well. So like there might be some maladaptive behaviors, for example like rumination. They keep on thinking about their experiences, so which might not be helpful. So then we will actually identify that and then also help them to think about brainstorm together what are some of the things that might be helpful for them to actually go through like the grief process a little bit more. So like the second approach is actually IPT, interpersonal relationship, the interpersonal therapy. So I actually identify a little bit more with this therapy approach. So what they actually focus on is that how they actually the way that they look at how relationship is formed and what happens to that relationship when the loss happens. So if I was to actually explain using my own understanding, so I often use like this analogy when we actually form a relationship with someone. So essentially, like, just imagine that all of us have like our own comfort bubble. So like a comfort zone. So when we form a relationship with someone, essentially we're inviting them into our bubble. So then when we are actually in the process of like adapting to having someone around, so we also form like certain habits when we are with them, and then like certain lifestyle changes as well when we the more like the time that we spend with them. So example, in like a romantic relationship, perhaps you might actually adapt to other people's eating habits, or like have form habits of like having text or like phone calls every night. So like those are some of the changes that we made when we actually start forming relationship. So when loss actually happens, like you said, suddenly like that person in your bubble gets taken away, or like they just left your bubble. So then you are actually left alone being in your bubble again. And that change alone is actually quite difficult, or like, the grief actually happens when we actually start to learn how to be alone again in our bubble. So like that's what IPT is actually focusing on. So to help us understand a little bit more, we can also tie in like the theories from like the dual process model, whereby they are suggesting that it will be very helpful for us to process grief by looking at two main directions. So like the first one is actually the loss, and then the second one is about the restoration. So like the loss, when we are talking about the loss, so what would be helpful in therapy is to provide space for clients to actually process, how they feel about that loss, or like, to honor certain memories that have, like what I mentioned, to create like a space for them to really talk about it and to really, appreciate some of the memories that they have, or like to really think about what are some of the important lessons that I've actually learned from this person. So like, just having space for us to actually process that is actually really helpful. So for the restoration process instead, so it's more like helping clients to actually get back to their routine without having that person. So it could be like, learning how to eat dinner on your own, or maybe discovering about different creative techniques. For example, like initiating dinners with like your friends and family, or like during the time when you're so used to texting your partner, like what are some of the other things that you could have actually done. So like, just to help them to get back on track on what they're actually you know uh, or what are some of the things that they can actually replace on their routine.
So you've mentioned about, I suppose, a theoretical model to understand how grief can be addressed by paying attention to the loss and also by initiating restoration. And I like to draw parallels between the two different approaches that you've shared, which is CBT and IPT, cognitive behavioral therapy or interpersonal psychotherapy, in which although it is formulated, conceptualized differently, there are similarities in terms of what is it that is being addressed. So in IPT, they define grief as specifically a client actually losing a person. So someone has actually passed away. So that is one phase of IPT. There's also another different area of IPT, which is the role transition. So I suppose in the broader sense of losing someone or something, IPT further breaks it down to two different areas. Either is grief and loss or a role transition. So a job loss, change of relationship status and whatnot. And the idea behind that is with grief and loss is uh, to put it very simply, there is a loss. So for that person who is used to a certain way of life with the other individual, now it is empty. Right? There's a hole there. So in analogy of the bubble has changed. But that individual is no longer there. So the bubble can no longer function in that way anymore. The bubble has to change. So we can take a look at the memories with the lost one, uh, the the experiences, the feelings towards the deceased as a way to uh, pay attention to the loss. But ultimately, also it is aside from some kind of emotional catharsis that happens during the session, it is also wanting to fill up the hole or trying going back to your analogy to perhaps change the bubble to one where the individual is able to live a life without that other person. So that might mean incorporating new activities, developing new relationships, strengthening existing relationships, basically trying to change behaviors in a way where the loss can actually be filled in. So those are the steps in IPT in addressing grief, which can draw parallels to CBT as well, because with CBT we are looking at behavioral as well as with cognitive changes. So if let's say someone is grieving for a year or a couple of years and they aren't able to function, there's likely some ways of thinking and behaving that maintains the grief. So I might not be, for example, going out with people. I might be staying in all the time. I might be skipping meals. These are the behaviors that maintain the grief reactions. And likely, with the help of a therapist, these are the behaviors that we like to target to perhaps change to alternative behaviors that could increase mood, could reduce the severity of the issue at hand. And similarly with the thoughts as well. There's going to be certain thoughts that maintain those behaviors. Examples could be like the one you mentioned about the guilt, right? So it's my fault. I should be doing something differently, or maybe thoughts about the future. There's no point to this. And these are some of the thoughts that likely a CBT therapist would like to target in order to restructure, to develop ways of thinking that is perhaps more fair and balanced, and perhaps will lead to new behaviors. So um, two approaches that seems to be rather different, but the goal, I would say, has commonalities. We'd like to acknowledge that the loss has happened. Yes, there are valid feelings that are involved here. And then we'd also like to initiate changes. Circumstances have changed now. Therefore, behavior has to change. The way that we think has to change. So those are the treatment methods that are available when it comes to addressing grief, especially more so when grief becomes complicated or prolonged. That is when people would need help in a more clinical sense, rather than the supportive help that they could also receive as part of grieving or going through a loss. Now, I wonder personally for you, based on your own personal and professional experience, how has that changed your understanding or approach towards working with grief with clients in therapy?
Hmm. So I think when we talk about grief, I actually relate it a lot with the love and care. So essentially, like I mentioned just now in our earlier session, just now we said that the intensity of grief actually highly depends on how closely we're attached to someone. So, like, what it also means here is that the more we actually love someone or the more we care for someone, so like likely the more intense the grief is going to be. So, when someone is actually, when we lost someone, unfortunately, like the love or care that we have is still gonna be there, but it's just that they are no longer there to actually receive. So when we actually understand like the concepts like this, so it's actually very important for us to also address like the love and care that they have towards this person, and then also finding ways to help them to repurpose their love. Of like finding different ways of how they can still continuing loving this person, while they're actually no longer here with us.
So that's the whole in CBT approach, the reframing,
Restructuring.
restructuring of the cognitions of the individual. And I think, going back to a more lay person understanding of grief, uh, it is something that, especially if the thing or the person holds a lot of sentimental value to us, the grief reactions are likely going to persist for a long period of time, perhaps even our entire life. But from a clinical standpoint, what we are looking at here is how deeply affected we are whenever we are grieving. I still do grieve about past pets, for example. Whenever there's reminders or just randomly throughout the day, I might have an instance or two of thinking of my deceased pet. But in terms of how much affects me in my day to day functioning, not no longer as much or no longer there, but I do still recognize that there is that feeling of grief. So perhaps what can be helpful is to really, I suppose, develop an alternative perspective on the loss, as what you've mentioned about repurposing the love, because quite likely, if our goal of coping is to suppress those feelings, whenever we are grieving, we try to push it away or try to distract ourselves. It's likely a strategy that is unlikely to work. Mm.
Another thing that is actually equally important is also managing expectations, because I also have a lot of clients coming in asking me, how can I stop grieving? Or how can I forget about this person? Or like, how long am I gonna, continue grieving? Especially when we're going through like the grief process, it's actually very painful and then we don't like feeling uncomfortable. So I think, in terms of helping clients to manage their expectation, we will also be giving them the right information as to how, telling them that as long as you still love, you're still gonna continue to grieve. But with that being said, it's not all doom and gloom, but it's just that we will actually need to learn how to grow with that grief feeling, with that, love feeling as well. So like we will actually need to learn how to, live on with our lives while carrying a piece of that with us, piece of that grief.
Now that you've mentioned about this, a thought that crossed my mind and something that we didn't talk about just now in terms of clinical approaches to addressing grief, complicated grief especially. There are approaches where the intention is to actually develop that sort of acceptance or mindfulness that there are all these feelings. It could be pleasant or unpleasant, but to recognize that this is the experience that's happening in the moment. Uh, because one way to which someone get into complicated grief is that they attempt to sort of alter their reality. I'm grieving right now, but I refuse to grieve. That actually makes things worse. So there are mindfulness approaches in therapy that assist the individual to develop skills in allowing themselves to acknowledge that there can be pleasant and unpleasant feelings, and regardless, life can still be meaningful and life can still be valuable and productive despite feeling, grief. Hmm. With that being said, I think we are faced with a time limitation in our episode right now. Uh, what do you think, if aside from meeting a therapist, can be some practical steps that you think the audience back home can try out if they are going through a moment in time where they are grieving?
Hmm. consistent with what I was sharing just now. So I think what would be helpful here is to actually allow yourself to acknowledge, not just that the fact that you have actually lost someone, but also acknowledge that, you have truly loved and cared, this person before. And that's why you're actually feeling this pain. So like also to normalize that this pain is actually, part of the process. So that it might not completely go away, but at the same time, it might actually diminish, right? So like the waves that crashes might get a little bit smaller or less intense. So like that moment will pass as well. So well, other than acknowledging, the love and then like the pain as well. So another thing that might be helpful here is to actually replan like how exactly are we going to continue on with our daily routine, or how can we actually adjust certain our future plans to actually be a little bit closer to what we want, to how we can actually craft our life even though with the absence of like something or someone that we love.
So, Vivian, what you have shared, I think it's more on the developing that ability to uh, accept that things will never be perfect. So, and then a thought that came through my mind, a mental image that came through my mind is, um, uh, let's say I'm living in a home and maybe my kitchen is going through a remodeling. So there's all that renovation work ongoing, but I'm still living in that house. So it's the same with going through grief. There is some ongoing work there. I'm grieving here, but how do I still live a life? How do I still live in this house where I need to use the living room, the bathroom, the go to bed, and that is the whole part about what you mentioned about life still going on. How can I remain functional? And I think what can really help with that, developing that acknowledgement, acceptance, and also to find a way to move, still have life ongoing despite what's happening, is on a more practical basis, engage in the societal rituals that perhaps, from the understanding of our forefathers, past generations, or thousands of years ago, they have decided that rituals are important for a very good reason. They might not understand why it's helpful in the past, but we recognize that being able to experience those feelings are going to be important as part of integrating that, part of acknowledging and accepting that before we can begin, I think, the whole restoration aspect of life. So if, for example, I lost a job, those farewell ceremonies at the company, or dinner out with family and friends, likely is going to be important. If someone passes away, attending the funeral, or setting aside time to reminisce about the individual. Some people might find writing letters, or just like how we write the obituary, for example, as a way to actually acknowledge that this has happened, as a way to actually seek closure. I suppose in romantic relationships, there's the breakup text or breakup letters. So all those are necessary aspects of human life that I think are very practical to be applied as a way of actually experiencing the grief, uh, and then being able to find ways to take a step forward from there.
Hmm. To add on that, I think seeking for social support might also be very helpful. So like to reconnect or like connect with like the people around you, like just to also like remind yourself that, hey, inside your bubble there are just still other people and other things that are equally important as well. To remind us that, we can actually appreciate them a little bit more, like show our love and care towards them as well. So that could be also a way for us to actually, feel a little bit more comfortable as we are going through grief.
Speaking of social support, immediately we could think of friends and family, which through the existing emotional bonds, we could actually spend time to actually experience the grief and to connect socially. At the same time, social support could also come in the form of shared experiences. So when we attend a wake, likely the attendees are people who similarly knew the person. But then if I'm going through a breakup or a job loss, or maybe it's a company-wide retrenchment, there are actually people who are going through a similar experience. We might not know them yet, and hence why there can be support groups, or I don't know, company emails
Or
with
even
everyone CC in.
forums. Should be
Yeah,
allowed,
all
right?
right. So online on Facebook, for example,
Yeah.
there are different groups that you
Yeah.
could join,
Mm.
where the idea is that although you're strangers, but you recognize that there is a similar experience that you've all been through together. And that can be part of the ritual, just speaking about that shared experience, as part of recognizing the grief and allowing it the space in order for that process of grieving to actually happen. So, Vivian, I think we have covered uh, to some extent about grief and loss. And this is the end of our time. Thank you for joining us on the show today. And I'm hoping that the audience back home found value in our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Be Kind to Your Mind. Found this content educational? Hit the subscribe button to stay updated on new episode every 2 weeks. See you soon.